Thank you very much for that introduction. I'm delighted to be here for this session on improving psychosocial care. Um, my my presentation is a little bit different because it's about family caregivers. And what I'll argue is that family caregivers are a very important part of psychosocial care in long-term care settings. I'll begin with what we know about this idea of good psychosocial care. So there's a lot of research on the experiences of burden and depression among caregivers of people with any kind of chronic disease, especially dementia. The other thing that we know is that caregiving is a career. You never do it for a very short period of time. It's not a short-term event. It's very much a long and drawn-out process. And that's what I'm going to go through with you today. But what we don't know is the experiences of burden and depression across the caregiving career, and that's the focus of my talk. I will, however, end with some implications for, okay, so what does this mean for care in the nursing home sector? So this study is actually based on Rhonda Montgomery and Carl Kozlowski's idea of this caregiving career and this caregiver identity theory. And it starts off with the idea that we all have multiple roles, right? So here I have, you could be a spouse, you could be a mother, an employee, a sister. We all have multiple roles. And our identity, which is comprised of these different roles, will change over time. And so in caregiver identity theory, there are two major roles that are of interest. The initial family role, whether you're a spouse or an adult child, and then this emerging caregiver role. And that's what I'm going to do in this next slide here. So we're going to walk through the caregiving career of a spouse. And I'll go over the theory this way. So at the beginning, the spouse is just performing the care task. And really at this point, the relationship is very much intact, that spousal relationship. Then as they keep going on, right, a little bit as time goes on, spouses will start to realize, you know what, I'm kind of doing a little more than I used to do, or maybe I never took care of the finances and all of a sudden now I'm in charge of that. And they slowly will start to see themselves or notice that the relationship is changing. And perhaps, they'll start identifying as a caregiver. Then we see that this is a really important part when the caregiving career includes the doing personal care tasks. So these are things like bathing, feeding, toileting, and they're very intimate care tasks. And for a lot of relationships, this will highlight that there is a change, a real shift. Maybe a relationship before was one where there was mutuality. You confided in each other. And now maybe there's less confiding and more doing of tasks and things that really highlight that there is a difference in this relationship. And then what the theory says is that people will consider nursing home placement. There'll just be the thought of it. Might not actually go ahead and place somebody in a nursing home, but there'll be that thought. Should I? Shouldn't I? Can I keep my loved one at home, or do I need to place? And then perhaps, so these are all hypothetical phases, perhaps somebody will actually place in a nursing home. But there are some two key points that I want you to think of. And they have to do with these changes in the identity. So at this part, you'll see that in the earlier stages of the career, you'll see that the family role is really predominant. In the middle stages, you get that half and half. Oh, yes, I am a spouse, but sometimes what I'm doing is very much like a caregiver. And in the latter phases that's when the caregiver says to themselves, you know what, we don't do anything we don't do that much that is reflective of our old relationship. It's very much about the disease and disease management. So what we see here is that there are challenges. The familial role will always be important, but it becomes challenged by what's happening in caregiving. And we also see the development of this caregiving role. And so the goal of our study was to look at, do experiences of burden and depression, do they change across the caregiving career? And I'll look at those different pie charts in the previous slide. And do they also change in terms of, are there differences between spouses and children? Because those are the people that you're going to be dealing with once they have actually placed. So this was a large study, and it's all the caregivers actually from the state of Washington. And so we have about 3,500 spouses and over 2,600 adult children in this study. And so we wanted to look at, are there differences between spouses and children and across the different phases? And we also wanted to control for problem behaviors, because, those are the things like agitation, aggression, or being overly clingy. Those behaviors are really tough for family caregivers. So we wanted to remove the effect, control for that, and also control for the amount of tasks, the amount of hours you're doing tasks. And then the outcome variables are burden, and I'll go through, there's 3 different kinds of caregiver burden. The first one is stress, right? That's the emotional anxiety, the tension I feel because I am a caregiver. The relationship burden is the extent to which the caregiver thinks that their family member is maybe like asking for too much, maybe making unreasonable requests, maybe being overly demanding. And then objective burden is time infringement. Because I'm a caregiver, I really have no time for anything, no time for myself, for friends, for vacations, for anything. Because you have to be really vigilant, especially if you're taking care of somebody with Alzheimer's disease. And then we also had depression. So this is what our sample looks like. I want you to pay attention to this caregiving length, because caregiving length has very little to do with the caregiving career. So because you'll have people, who've been providing care for a very long time, like the 5 years and over, who still see themselves mostly in the spousal role. So it's not length of time that's really important in terms of the caregiving career. It's more about these changes in the identity. All right, so let's get to the good stuff. So this is what we found. I'll start first with spouses. So you'll see here that as people go through this career, there is an increase. You'll see that there's a difference between those in this phase, where I see myself half and half as a spouse and a caregiver. There's a big jump between that group and those who see themselves mostly as a caregiver. And then there's no difference between the first 2 phases for spouses. And then there is a significant difference between that first and the 3rd phase. Now, here are children. Let's take a look at what's happening with them. So they start off kind of a little bit lower on stress. And again, actually for children, they're different everywhere. That first phase where they see themselves mostly as a family, as an adult child, I am a daughter, that is very different from the phase where I see myself as a daughter and I see myself equally as a caregiver. And that is, again, significantly different than I see myself, not so much as a daughter anymore and more as a caregiver. I'm just doing these things, and I don't feel very comfortable as I'm doing these. And so this pattern actually is going to be very similar for all our outcome measures. And then we wanted to know, are there differences between spouses and children? Well, there are. So spouses are a bit more stressed in that earlier phase, but then we see the flip, and this is a really good point. You'll see that in this middle phase, the adult children have a really hard time. And this is where they're starting to do these intimate personal care tasks. And you can just put yourself in the position of a child, like an adult daughter or son, if you're having to bathe your parent. That really starts to show that, the relationship has changed. It's something that I'm not comfortable with anymore. And so I think that's really what's happening here where we see the children having a tougher time than the spouses. Because for spouses, oftentimes they say, you know what? This is what I signed up for, right? In sickness and in health. So they usually they'll get all stressed really towards the end, because they see some of their caregiving tasks as extensions of that spousal role, whereas adult children, not so much. They get really stressed right at that first sign of a major shift. And so the pattern actually is quite similar. So I'll go through them. For relationship burden, this is where I think that my parent or my spouse is being like overly demanding. We see that same within phase differences for these two different groups. And then we also see that same change where the children have a harder time. They feel like their parent is a little more demanding or making more unreasonable requests than spouses do. And then objective burden, that is that time infringement. I got no time because I'm a caregiver. And so again, the same pattern for spouses and the same pattern for adult children. So it's kind of easy to go through these slides quickly. And then where they're different though, again, the children really feel strapped for time in that middle phase. And again, we see major differences between children and spouses. And part of it, children have a lot of other responsibilities too. Maybe they're taking care of their own children, and so they're part of that sandwich generation. And we see that showing up in terms of this objective burden. Depression has a similar pattern. So again, spouses really have a difficult time between that second phase and the third phase, and between that first phase and the third phase. And then for adult children, we see actually they are less depressed. Oh, that's coming up soon. They're a little bit lower on depression than children, but this is where we see the main difference is that spouses are having a harder time and really feeling down in the latter phase. So let's just look at what does this all mean? So we quickly summarize the findings. So in terms of these differences between children and spouses, we see that it's this middle phase that's where children are having a harder time. They've got more stress, more relationship burden, more objective burden when that relationship identity is equally between those two phases. And we see that children have a harder time than spouses for objective burden in that latter phase. The only time spouses have a harder time than children is for depression. And again, it's from that latter phase. So this next slide looks at, okay, what are some of the main pattern for spouses alone was that they have a difficult time in that middle phase, is much more, they have lower negative outcomes than that latter phase, and also big differences between that first phase and the third phase. And for adult children, everything was significantly different, and it progressively got worse. So I will end with, what does this mean for long-term care? Because this is about family members. Well, I think it's important to know that it's the negative outcomes, the burden and the depression, they're actually not about what you're doing, but it's about how does what you're doing make you feel? So for some people, they might say, you know what, you feeding my husband is not a big deal. Right? So it's just an extension of my spousal role. But maybe feeding my father is really different, because maybe I looked up to him. He was like this strong figure, and now I'm feeding him. So every individual is going to be different, and every task is going to be interpreted differently for each individual. So it's not about what you're doing, it's how you feel when you're doing that. It's the meaning that's attached to the role that's important. So when might you, in long-term care, see these family caregivers? Well, you're probably going to see them, the adult children, in that half and half phase. And it's not that they're giving up, it's just, it's too much. It's too much mentally in that second phase. And that's when you'll see the adult children place a parent in a nursing home. Spouses, when I've interviewed spouses, they're so hardy. A lot of these relationships are like 50 years or more. So they'll hang on and take care of their husband or wife or partner at home until they just can't do it anymore. And so you'll see them in this phase. It's once they feel like that relationship is no longer, the way that it was, then they'll start to place. Now, you, I'm sure, all know that the caregiver role continues after nursing home placement. It doesn't end. It's not like the relationship has ended. And so, according to this theory, really, if there's enough support in the nursing home, that relationship identity, which, especially the, I can't go back, but the latter phase should actually shift back, because now we're not doing any of the tasks that make us feel like the relationship is changing. We actually have the luxury of time as a family member to connect. I can connect with my father, or I can connect with my spouse in terms of that relationship and not worry about the tasks. And so then the challenge to long-term care staff is, what can you do? How can you help restore that familiar role? Because if you have a happy family member, you're going to have happy staff and happy residents, right? Because sometimes that relationship between staff and residents can be, staff and residents and staff and family members can be a little bit tricky to negotiate. So what are some opportunities that you have in terms of recreation or dining experience or exercise classes? Make sure that you include, like really purposefully design them so that the family member is included, because then you're going to improve psychosocial care really for each stakeholder, the resident, the family, and the staff. And I will end with that. Thank you.